What's up, guys? We are starting the Virginia governorship live stream. We have about 30 minutes until the polls officially close, but there is a lot of data out right now that we can analyze to help to determine who we think the winner is going to be. So, right now, first going to the prediction markets. This is actually following a lot of what I predicted before. So I don't think that we're gonna officially know who's the winner in this race until probably later in the night. However, what we know at this point is that turnout has been extremely high. And in a past video, I was saying that high turnout was probably going to help the Democrats. However, so far, turnout has been high in the Republican areas and in the Democratic areas. And I think overall, net, looking at different data on the county-wide level, that Republican turnout is higher than Democratic turnout, even though on both sides of the aisle, turnout is very high. So I mean, there's a lot of data that I can cover here. That's going to be very relevant to the races, and I would also love to answer your questions in the chat here. So anything you might ask. Some really good people on Twitter to follow. I like J. Miles Coleman, and there's a lot of people on election Twitter right now that have some good takes. I do think that this race is just going to come down to turnout. I mean, the conventional wisdom that has been that because Virginia is a Biden plus 10 state on the presidential level, that increased turnout, anything that goes over 3 million votes, is going to help the Democrats. However, I think that we're going to see maybe close to 80% of people who voted for Trump in the 2020 election turnout. We saw that in Georgia for the runoff Senate race, that there was a lot of decreased turnout among Republicans, especially more kind of in the northern Georgia, where Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, because they didn't trust the election, that they thought the 2020 presidential election was stolen, so they weren't going to turn out. Among the Republicans in the rural areas, I do not think that we're seeing this in Virginia. Of course, we are not going to see turnout as high as it was in the 2020 presidential election, but so far, it appears like that we're going to get turnout higher than the 2017 presidential election. In many counties, in many precincts, turnout is already higher than it was in 2017. And 2017 was one of these blue wave years where we did see a lot of turnout because of kind of the anti-Trump sentiment here. So I predict that turnout's going to be around the range of 3.1 to 3.2 million. At the I would say last week, most of the estimates were between 2.6 and 2.8 million. That's even what I said, but it's not clear who the increased turnout is going to help. Obviously, in the um, areas in northern Virginia, because it's closer to the Washington D.C. There's a lot of politically active people. Nova, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, those have shifted left a lot. But what have we seen with Glenn Youngkin? He's actually going into counties that have shifted left a lot. Like Loudoun County went for over 20 points for Biden, but the Glenn Youngkin campaign thinks that they can win this. So right now, just kind of like summarize where I am right now. I do think that Glenn Youngkin will pull it out. I have him projected to win between 0 and 2 percentage points. I think it's going to be very, very close. I think because of the increased turnout, that the margin is going to be pretty tight. So people who are betting on the politics, I mean, while the betting markets have gone kind of, I mean, they've gone up and down and up and down. Right now, they have Youngkin at 58 cents on predicted, which would suggest that he's going to win. So let me kind of go to the chat and answer some questions. And if you're on this live stream, please enter in the chat so I kind of know what to focus on here. But do you think Republicans can win back the Senate next year? So the Senate's going to be pretty interesting. I do think with the House in 2022 that the Republicans are definitely going to win. I would kind of lock that in right now. The Senate is going to be very, very interesting in states like Georgia and states like Arizona and in other states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. It's going to be hard to know. I actually think that the Senate in 2022 will be more of a toss up. As I'm getting more viewers in here, I do kind of want to focus on the governor's election at hand tonight. I do think Glenn Youngkin has an advantage. Right now, he's trading at 58 cents, so he probably has close to a 60% chance to win. I just think with all this late gaining momentum, and frankly think that Terry McAuliffe has run a very bad campaign. His closing message was, "I'm running against Donald Trump." Glenn Youngkin stands for Donald Trump. We saw that this message didn't work. Um, Glenn Youngkin is not Donald Trump, and I think he's actually done a pretty good job of distancing himself from kind of the more polarizing rhetoric that we know that the moderates in Virginia don't appreciate. So let's see. Um, we have a couple of people in the chat. Um, I do not think that there's going to be much voter fraud, if at all, in this election. Both sides, on the Democrats and on the Republican side, have lawyered up. They've hired about 10 lawyers each. I do think because this race is going to be very, very close, that we might not see either side concede tonight. Um, Mail-in ballots, those are going to be huge. They can come in until Friday at the latest if they're postmarked before today. So, and it's likely that those mail-in ballots are going to um, come from more Democrats. However, I think when the first results come out, which they're going to come out in about 20 minutes here, I do think that we're going to see more of a blue mirage because we know and we have this data that more registered Democrats came out to vote early, and we know that more of kind of the working class voters who tend to skew more Republican, they're going to be coming off work at 5 o'clock, 5:30, and they're going to vote for Glenn Youngkin later at higher numbers than I think that Terry McAuliffe voters. I think that what we saw today is um, a lot of votes for Terry McAuliffe came kind of in this early range from when the polls opened to around 5 p.m. I mean, these are not your traditional working class voters. They're people who, because of the pandemic, can work from home and can walk to their nearest polling station. I actually voted today. I'm at a college. There's a polling place very close, but many people with working class jobs, they're coming from work and they have to drive to the polling spots. Um, One interesting development, we did see some weather kind of go in the or that come up in the Nova, Northern Virginia region. Some people were saying that this might depress turnout, especially in a more heavily Democratic area. But one other thing you have to consider with that is election day voting tends to be more Republican. We saw this in the 2020 presidential election. So I would take the whole weather argument with a grain of salt. Anecdotally, I mean, we're seeing everywhere in Northern Virginia, in Virginia Beach, in the rural counties, that turnout is high. And everyone's saying high turnout, but what does that mean? I mean, high turnout compared to what? So I think I mean, people obviously aren't comparing it to the 2020 presidential election. There was 4.6 million Virginians who voted in the 2020 presidential election. We aren't even going to get to 75, 80% of that number. However, I mean, in the 2013 um, governorship race, there was about 2.2 million people who voted, and in the 2017 there was about 2.6 million. So Terry McAuliffe is going to have to win um, around 100 to 200,000 more votes in the 2021 race compared to the 2013 race that ended up being a squeaker. Obviously Terry McAuliffe is a former governor. So let me go to the questions. Do you think it'll be close in New Jersey's, like under 5% for Democrats? So, I mean, the one reason why I'm not focusing as much in New Jersey is even if the Republicans do overperform, I think it is going to be something in the range of 4 to 6%. My guess is that the Phil Murphy, the incumbent Democrat, will probably win between 6 and 8%. I'm not too worried about the results here. Obviously they will say something about the national sentiment, maybe about Biden's approval rating generally, but I think that this race in Virginia, I mean, obviously people will have takes going forward, what this means for the 2022 midterms, what this means for the viability of the Biden agenda. Will Biden try to maybe not try to be as radical on his policy? Will he try to work with Republicans if he sees kind of a major backlash? I mean, this is all to be seen in the kind of what people take. So, one thing that I think is pretty interesting is so Trump actually did not insert himself in this race at all. I think this is something that Glenn Youngkin didn't necessarily want. I mean, he knows that in a state where Biden won by 10 points, that if this was a referendum on Trump, then um, that wouldn't be good for the Republicans. But I think Glenn Youngkin has actually done a pretty good job of kind of playing both sides. So he definitely has, I think, been able to retain the Trump base. I mean, he's obviously better than Nick Cole, but I think all this energy and enthusiasm is coming from the issue of education, and whether it's critical race theory or just parents having a more say in their children's education. I mean, Terry McAuliffe had a really bad gaffe, I think, when he said in a debate that he doesn't think parents should have a um, big role in their children's education. So, as we were talking, I see that so there's some exit polls coming in, and so we have some exit polls from CNN, from Fox News, and MSNBC. So I'm going to take a look at what they have to say. Um, so far, it seems like these exit polls are pretty good for the Republicans. I mean, there is some concern that maybe that they're a little bit skewed towards the Republicans, so it wouldn't really tell us much. But from these exit polls, they say that it's about 48% for Biden and 46% for Trump. So whether you voted in the presidential election, so what that breakdown tells me is that this is very good for Glenn Youngkin because you're gonna have some Biden voters. I mean, we've seen it anecdotally, but I think we've also seen it through the polls that there's a lot of, or I mean, there's a good chunk of kind of these independent Biden voters who are voting for Glenn Youngkin. And it's because of the issue of education. Um, and so, I mean, right now, from what I've seen, is on these exit polls. I mean, they do not look very good for Terry McAuliffe, and they look good for Glenn Youngkin to pull up the upset. Um, One thing that I will say is all these polls coming out recently. I mean, that Fox News +8 poll. Obviously, I don't think Glenn Youngkin's going to win by 8 points, but I mean that poll is very significant. And I mean, I hear that some people like to dismiss it because they're like, oh, Fox News, that's more of a right wing poll. But Fox News has been fairly accurate, and they've even been a little bit more left leaning on the polls. What Fox News does is do a pretty harsh screen on the likely voters. And so this kind of it's more on the enthusiasm factor, and I mean Glenn Youngkin definitely has the enthusiasm factor, and I've heard people say so. Young people who are voting for Glenn Youngkin are his supporters, people who really want him to be governor. People who are voting for Terry McAuliffe just hate Trump. They're just purely anti-Trump. You don't have a lot of people who are diehard Terry McAuliffe supporters, and I do think that this is going to hurt him. Anecdotally, and in some of the data, we've seen that voters of color do not seem to be as inclined to turn out for Terry McAuliffe like the same numbers that they did for Joe Biden in 2020. From the exit polls, we see that 73% of the voters are white, and that's up from estimates that were about 70%. So, I mean, and that this is likely going to help Republicans. I mean, Virginia is a fairly diverse state. It's become more college educated, which we would think would help the Democrats, and it has on the presidential level. This is to say that George W. Bush won twice, Obama won it twice, Hillary Clinton, and then Biden won it by 10 points, which was a massive margin. But I think we're going to see Glenn Youngkin. He has some crossover with these voters, so we're going to see a lot of Biden voters vote for Glenn Youngkin, and I mean, obviously, as a whole, I do think college educated voters in Virginia are going to go for Terry McAuliffe, but those non-educated voters, especially more in the rural parts, I think are going to turn out heavily for Glenn Youngkin, and his campaign has done a huge effort. I mean, you've one of kind of his central components to this campaign has been his bus. He spent thousands and thousands of miles in the last few weeks visiting all these areas, turning people out. And people just seem to like the guy. They think it's really personable. He isn't a Washington politician. He hasn't been in politics. He's come from his personal life, and he's self-funded his campaign to a large degree. But I think he also has a lot of grassroots support, and his rallies anecdotally show a large number of people at them. And I mean, people, I mean, obviously, crowd size isn't necessarily an indicator for how much support you're going to get at the polls. But we saw in 2016 and 2020, I mean, in the 2016 Republican primary, Trump was have these massive rallies with huge crowds, and other candidates like Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz just couldn't garner the same amount of support. So I think that looking at the crowd size factor, we can definitely say that Glenn Youngkin is doing better. So, yeah, so one data point that we already know is that the turnout in this governor's race is going to beat anything that we've ever seen. Loudoun County, I think, is going to be a very interesting county to look at. I mean, we know that Youngkin is going to overperform Trump there, and I mean, while I don't think that he's going to win this county just because it has trended leftward so much. If he can shrink the margins there, then I think it would be a very good night right now. So only about 10 minutes until the polls close. In 2017, the last Virginia's governor's race, we knew that the governor was going to be Ralph Northam at about 7:30. And I mean, this was a race. I mean, looking back at it, it wasn't close. But going into election night, I mean, there's a lot of articles that are kind of popping up now. People are like, "Oh, this is going to be a very close race," because the polls had it within 3 points. And I mean, Glenn Youngkin has overtaken Terry McAuliffe in the polls, but he's only up by one. So, but we do have Biden as the president. So we have a Democrat as the president. And typically, in these kind of off presidential election years, the opposing party does better. So if y'all have any questions, I'll definitely put them in the chat here. We have a lot of interesting developments on Twitter, and as the information comes in, I will definitely keep y'all updated here. So the New York Times is not doing their traditional needle. That has actually been fairly accurate at uh, turning out results. So let's see. Let me look in the comments here. I would encourage y'all to definitely uh, write something in the comments. So Jets Unleashed says, if Republicans win, could this be the turning point for Republicans? So I think yes. So I mean, coming out of 2020, I do think that the Republicans are a little bit in disarray. I mean, with Trump at the top of the ticket after it happened on January 6th and kind of the how that situation unfolded. I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty at what is the future path for the Republican Party. Mike Pence did give a speech where in a pretty good speech, I think, where he kind of talked about the lessons that we've learned from a Trump presidency and how we go from there. I definitely do think that the Republican Party is becoming more working class than it has traditionally. They're kind of winning over these union voters who traditionally have supported the Democrats in the past. So I definitely think that the Republicans focus on labor. But one thing that this specific election can tell Republicans is that education is a winning issue for them. So I mean, in a Biden plus 10 states, um, Youngkin focused on the issue of critical race theory, which I think will be a winning issue for Republicans too. And obviously, the school board did not handle what happened in Loudoun County very well at all, and that's something that Youngkin leaned into. So I mean, people have said that they think that if Glenn Youngkin wins, that he could be a presidential candidate in 2024. I'm not that high on Glenn Youngkin. I think he's a phenomenal candidate for the Virginia governor's race. I think he's probably one of the only candidates who could have won, and I think he's done very well to kind of, I mean, not change what he believes in, but kind of pivot on his focus from the primary to the general elections. Um, so Keenan Paul says, "Do you think moderate Republicans take back their party?" So I don't think that. I mean, I guess Trump would call these moderate Republicans more rhinos. I don't think that we're going to become or I don't think the Republican Party is going to become the party of Mitch McConnell, the party of Paul Ryan, the party of Liz Cheney. I don't think that's going to happen. But I also don't think that the Republican Party is going to become kind of like a cult of Trump. Like I don't think it's going to become the party of Donald Trump Jr., of like Trump, just like the most kind of Trumpy versions. And I do think we're going to see more people like Glenn Youngkin, which I think he has done a pretty good job of kind of playing to both sides, the more moderate Republicans or even moderate independents or even moderate Democrats, but also kind of keeping up his support with the Trump base. And one thing I do think that Republicans can take from this race and be encouraged about is the fact that voter turnout is high in a lot of Republican areas. I mean, after kind of Trump alleging that there was a lot of voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election, we saw what that did to turnout in the Georgia runoffs. It handed the race to the Democrats. But I think here, and I mean, we don't know who the winner is, but even if McAuliffe wins by a very small margin, we can be encouraged that I mean, the kind of the enthusiasm for Republicans is there. One point that I want to make is a lot of people are saying that the Virginia race is like definitely a bellwether for the 2022 midterms and maybe even for the 2024 presidential election. Well, one thing that people always say is 1 week or even 1 month can be an eternity in politics. And I mean 1 year is an eternity too. I mean 1 year from now, I was doing the live streams and covering the election night, the presidential election night between Trump and Biden, and that seems so far from now. So I mean, I don't even know what we will be focusing on in 2022. I do think that we're going to see a heightened focus on the issue of education. I do think that will come up. I do think that we're going to see immigration be a focus. Um, but yeah, okay. So guys, I definitely want to answer your questions. The polls are about to close in 3 minutes and 30 seconds. That doesn't mean that all the counting will be finished. People who are in line before 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern can still vote, and the mail-in ballots will still be counted up until Friday if they're postmarked today or earlier. So we might not go to sleep tonight knowing who the presidential election is, or who the governor of Virginia will be. But let's kind of go over to the betting markets. I want to see where we're at right now. So it appears as if nothing has actually changed that much. The Glenn Youngkin is still favored, and obviously Phil Murphy is favored in the New Jersey election. I know that we wanted to focus on that. So let's see. Anthony S. asks, could the fact that 71% of Americans think Biden is leading in the wrong direction be a factor? So I definitely think that this election in Virginia is partially, like, people are going to vote partially on what they kind of feel on the national stage. And on a state that voted Biden plus 10 for this race to be competitive, I mean, you're going to have to see Biden's support erode. And I think that um, what we saw with this poll, that about 71% of Americans think that Biden is leading the country in the wrong direction, that could be a factor. I think one thing that we're going to see is, so the polls are about to close in a minute and 30 seconds, so we might start seeing results coming up pretty soon. I think we're going to see Terry McAuliffe take an early lead in this race, but that's not going to tell us anything, frankly, because the votes that are going to be counted first are going to be the votes by mail, and we know from history that mail-in votes typically are more democratic, and we have this data. So 63% of the mail-in votes, early mail-in votes, or and early voting as a whole, came from 63% of them were Biden voters, and obviously some of those Biden voters are going to cross over and vote for Glenn Youngkin. So maybe we're going to see about a 60-40% margin for Terry McAuliffe coming in tonight. But I mean, this is going to be a very, very interesting race. I mean, compared to the 2017 Virginia governor's election, turnout is going to be through the roof. Um, what's pretty interesting is, so the highest predicted margin right now on Predictit is a Youngkin victory over 3 points. And I frankly don't think that this is very likely. I think that the reason why it's winning is because it has the most uh, it has the most options. So the polls have just closed in Virginia. So if you haven't made it to the polling place, you can no longer vote. If you haven't sent in your mail-in ballot, it will no longer count. If you are in line, though, you should stay in line because that will count. So we're going to kind of look at some exit polls by age. So McAuliffe is only up from the 18-29 demographic by 7 points, which frankly should not be very encouraging for Terry McAuliffe. This is a good sign for Glenn Youngkin, actually. But because, and I think one issue that's going to contribute to this a lot is the COVID issue. I mean, people are not very enthusiastic about the mask mandates, especially at colleges. Um, and then we see among voters 65 and older that Youngkin's actually winning in Virginia, that is a blue state, by 6 points. So this isn't necessarily a horrible sign. I mean, we do see that older voters typically tend to vote for the Republicans. But let's see. So who do you think is going to win Prince William County, Glenn or Terry? So let's kind of dive into the county level data. So I mean, obviously not one county is going to matter more than anything else. But looking at the data from Prince William County, it looks like that right now it's going to be too close to call. However, if I had to guess right now, I'd probably say, well, hmm, it's gonna be hard to know. I mean, I would guess that the Terry McAuliffe would have an advantage there just because of its proximity to Washington D.C., but it will definitely be close. So one thing that's interesting is like looking at the independent vote, which I think independent voters are going to determine this election. We do see that Glenn Youngkin does have an advantage right now with those by about 5 points. Will this be enough to win? It's going to be hard to know. We do see in the exit polls that I will want to take with a grain of salt that Glenn Youngkin is losing with white college educated voters by 4 points. However, I think this was to be as expected in the 2016 or 2020 presidential election. It was a much higher margin. Okay, guys, so I think I'm going to take a quick break from this live stream, but I will be back soon. So see you guys in a bit.